What's going on, guys? Master Coach and Education Director with Living.Fit and Kettlebell Kings. I'm here with now a really good friend of mine. We got to spend some time in Costa Rica. But way before that, just a brilliant mind when it comes to understanding human physiology, human metabolism, and how our metabolic systems work, physiologic flexibility, diet flexibility. And I think my favorite aspect of Dr. Mike T. Nelson is that he takes what I think is the most effective approach to helping coach people, whether they're the elite level athlete that's trying to shave off that next little edge, or the person that's just getting into this thing that is fitness and nutrition and all these overwhelming and way over marketed concepts. And it's this choose your own adventure kind of model, or choose your own nutrition, or choose your own fitness adventure. And by creating these A/B choices, eventually that person will have incredible success. So without further ado, Dr. Mike T. Nelson, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you very much for having me on here, and good to see you again. That was good times in Costa Rica for sure.
I know that was great. That was awesome. We had some pretty interesting conversations. I think the most interesting to me is you've been afforded the opportunity to be in school way too long.
Yes, that is true.
Of a better term. So maybe we'll start there. So what got you kind of intrigued and into learning, but then how did that kind of take a turn for fitness and understanding the physiologic system and physiological system and metabolic systems?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always been interested in physiology, and maybe because when I was 4.5, I had an open heart surgery, had an atrial septal defect. So I had that surgically repaired, and, luckily haven't had any issues from that since then. But you always think back over the course of your life and the exposure to that, going to a pediatric cardiologist. And I remember, little bits and pieces before the surgery and him having a little heart model and explaining to me what they were going to do. And, having to go back to follow-ups there, even up until I was age 40, actually. So I'm, 36, sitting in the waiting room of the, Minnesota Children's Hospital. And they call your name and they're like, "Oh, are you here with your kids?" I'm like, "Nope, just me." And then when I went to college, it was similar from a lifting standpoint. I was a 6'3" eel-shaped rake at 156 pounds. And this is, after all your puberty and growth spurts and all that kind of stuff. So I'm like, maybe I should try this lifting thing. That might be beneficial. So started doing that. And most, especially guys, I probably did everything wrong for about 10 years and got some of it kind of right. And during the time, I just started taking physiology classes for fun. I took anatomy and physiology. My undergrad was a Bachelor of Arts in Natural Science, and a minor in chemistry. And I didn't really know what to do with physiology at that point. So I had a radio controlled car that I would spend hours just manipulating, like one of the bigger 10 scale ones. And I would tear stuff apart and not put it back together. So everyone's like, "Oh, well, you should go into engineering then because you like doing mechanical stuff." I'm like, "Okay, that sounds interesting." So I thought, well, I'll do, biomedical engineering. But this is back in at that point, like the mid 90s, early 90s. And no one really kind of knew what that was because it was pretty new. So I ended up going to Michigan Tech. I did 2 years of postgraduate stuff in mechanical engineering. Then I did a master's in mechanical engineering there. My coursework, all that stuff was more in biomechanics, but I couldn't get any funding. So I ended up going over to the Center for Biomedical Research that just opened. And I created a model of a monkey head where we zap a monkey with high frequency microwaves.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the military later tested it out on humans and monkeys. And then now if you look up something called the active denial system, or the press calls it a ray gun. It was actually just in the press again, like 4 months ago, that there was some rumblings that the military was going to, try it out for crowd dispersion again. And that, you can imagine how well that would go over in the popular media. But it's just a big transmitter, and it feels like your skin's being burnt by a light bulb. So people will scatter out of way of the beam. And yes, I did that for quite a while. And then once I got done, I was like, I don't know. I worked for a medical device company for a while, and then literally just annoyed trainers by going to fitness conferences and asking them why they don't read research, which doesn't make you a lot of friends. As I found out.
It might be the truth, but not everybody likes the truth. It's like
no. And they're like, well, we come to conferences like this, so we don't have to read research. I'm like, oh, that's a very valid point. I didn't think of that. And so I did a little short stint doing a PhD in biomedical engineering for a while. Never got to doing research per se. And then as I was 5 years into that program, I actually dropped out and went over to the exercise physiology department. So I got tired of doing advanced math. I remember being in an MRI class, and there's PhDs in mathematics and physics. I was the only mechanical person in there, and I'm looking around, and the guy just starts drawing. He's like, all right, for MRI, we're now going to draw all the raw equations used in MRI. And he starts drawing stuff on the board, and I'm looking around, and I'm like, I have a minor in mathematics, and I don't even know what he's writing. It just looked like hieroglyphics on the board. And so I poked the guy in front of me who is a PhD in physics. I'm like, hey, man, do you know what's going on? He's like, no. And he's just rapidly like writing stuff down. And it was at that point, I'm like, yeah, maybe I should just switch. So I started a PhD in exercise physiology then. Paradoxically, got stuff assigned to me involving math. The first meeting I had in fall, my advisor then comes in. He's like, hey, all right, we got 2 new projects. One's on metabolic flexibility and one's on heart rate variability, and they both involve math. And so if you're normally doing, kinesiology, exercise phys, metabolism, you don't really take a lot of math. It's not really part of the requirement per se. So he looks around the table and he points at me and he's like, hey, you, math boy, whatever your name is. He's like, these are your projects now, because you came from engineering, right? I'm like, yeah. He's like, all right, here you go. So that's how I got looking at more metabolic flexibility in a formal level. And that started 13 years ago. So, and along the way, I started training clients, worked at gyms for a while. Gym filed bankruptcy. I got mad and started training people out of my garage instead. And that was probably the best thing that ever happened. Was much nicer just to kind of do things on your own at your own pace and whatever you wanted to do. So that was good. Actually useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so obviously you're coming from super high cognitive level or cerebral level of understanding, physiologic flexibility or metabolic flexibility, right? And specific with like your flex diet cert or your physiologic flexibility cert, right? But you clearly are able to give it to somebody who's entry level, who doesn't understand
right.
it. And so what do you think, like, how do you think the best way is to bridge that gap between, obviously you could give them all these formulas and you could, probably melt their brain with all of the different research articles, that you've poured through to come up with a greater understanding of it. But instead of doing that, you've chosen a different route. And I don't know, maybe you can kind of explain that a little bit. Because I've kind of been on the student end of it with you. But I think even the end user view would be really advantageous.
Yeah, that was actually the biggest sort of problem I wanted to solve once I decided I was going to actually do a certification. And so I gave myself 9 months to kind of figure it out, I guess. The material I had been, researching, looking at for that point, like well over a decade. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't too worried about the material, and you can always read more research and, always, PhD, that's your skill set. So you're pretty good at that. The problem was what I saw, there was some good info products, but it was just an info product. It was like, hey, if you want to learn more about protein or whatever, cool, that's great. There were some other certifications, which are still great, like precision nutrition, John Berardi and those guys started, which is awesome. I love it. But that was much more on the habit change side. And a lot of the questions I got were more on, well, what I do on the physiology type side. Yeah. But I also knew that there had to be some form of psychology and how to get people to actually do it, because without that, it doesn't matter anyway, right? It's not just knowledge, it's applied knowledge. So what I came up with is I said, okay, so what do I want people to know? Well, first, they kind of have to know context, right? They got to know like what I call the big picture. Like, why are you doing this? Why should you look at metabolic flexibility? What are the components of it? Like, how do all the pieces fit together? Because to my opinion, if you don't understand context, then you're dangerous, right? You're running around with a hammer, you're looking for nails like everywhere.
Enough to get you in trouble.
Right. You're like, this XYZ doesn't matter, keto, paleo, whatever, pick your form, and they all have their pros and cons.
Yeah.
If you're diet X, you're just looking around to apply diet X to like everything. That's what annoyed me to no end. So I'm like, so what if we just have like a continuing evolution of, okay, here's the big picture, what we want you to know about the concept, how all the pieces fit together. And then with the subset of each one, I said, okay, here's the 8 interventions I'm going to talk about. I'm going to have like a technical primer, I called it. So I have 1 hour. So I set myself a constraint. I have 1 hour to teach you as a student something very technical that's true and somewhat simplified, but not so simple that it's actually no longer true anymore. Because I saw that too, right? You know, carbs are good, carbs are bad. You know, eat more fat. Ooh, protein's evil now, right? And all those things.
Oh, now protein's the only thing you should eat.
Right. You have like no macronutrients left to eat. So I said, okay. And I purposely gave myself like 1 hour to do it because to the end user, it would have been easier for me to just say, okay, here you've got 8 hours, do a lecture on protein. Woohoo! That's pretty easy once you've accumulated the knowledge. It is horribly boring to anybody else, right? No one wants to sit through 8 hours of it.
No.
So I said, okay,
I mean, unless you really like stabbing yourself in the eye with a pen.
Yeah, have like a rusty spoon and dig your eyeball out, right? So I said, okay, I got 1 hour or less to condense it, have all the references, all the technical stuff, so that if someone has a question about protein, right? So the client goes, hey, why am I eating more protein? Why do I give a rat's ass about leucine, the branched chain amino acids matter? You know, stuff like that. You would have enough background that you could give them an intelligent answer. Yeah. And then the third part is, okay, here's 5 specific action items of what to specifically do, right? Because one of the downsides I saw with some other programs was they had really good info. Everything was great. It was accurate. It was correct. But they kind of shied away from giving you something specific to do. And trainers, as you know, are looking for, okay, this is great. What is the thing that I actually do? And if it wasn't provided, they usually then kind of dropped the action ball. They weren't really sure. And then they're not sure and they just kind of don't do anything. So I said, okay, here's 5 specific action items per intervention. Like you said, you get to kind of pick your own adventure. So then all 5 of them will work. But as we know, each person has a preference for this or not for that. So it gives you this kind of optionality to kind of weave your way through, stay somewhat on task, right? So you don't end up out in, left field completely, worried about protein or whatever. But it's not like you have to know exactly what it is. And if you didn't get your 2.897 grams of leucine per meal, like all your muscle is going to fall off, right? And that's not true either. So
I love that approach because it's so approachable. And I mean, that's something that I think has been the most attractive piece of our coursework is you can immediately apply any of the nuggets that you've gleaned from, whether it's the 6 hour or the 2 day today, right now with your clients, or with yourself, like immediately, as opposed to you have to spend a ton of time really understanding this abstract ethereal idea to be able to put it into a mechanical chunk that now you can put into your lifestyle and start to use it, which it's like, it's almost this, there tends to be this like bifurcated line where it's either like way too heady or like way oversimplified, like you said, where now it's not true because it's too simplified. It's like, this is the only solution. It's like, really. So I really am, you talk a lot about cold, and I think you and I agreed in Costa Rica, which was not cold at all.
No, it wasn't. It was great.
Wonderful. Now you and I are freezing. That was a nice little break. So you and I both agreed it's not like helping you gain massive amounts of strength or become this like invincible endurance athlete or whatever. but it is helping, and it tends to be more of that like psychological. And you said it today, I think in your email, you said eustress, right, as opposed to distress, where you're just constantly undergoing this chronic stress that you're feeling all the time. But it's a minimal version of it that you can handle. And so let's talk a little bit about some of your cold therapy stuff, because I know you have a refrigerator that's like on its side, and now you use as your cold therapy. So you're clearly into, bits of cryo, and you can handle the cold probably far more than maybe the average human, right? Just because of where you live and what you've done. But that's not necessarily making your deadlift bigger or whatever, but it is helping you. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So when people think cold, they think cold water immersion, some of the stuff Wim Hof and others have done. And when I first got into it, my first thought, like everyone else, is like, oh, like I see all these advanced athletes doing, cold plunges and this stuff. And I'm like, God, it's got to be like amazing for recovery. And then you read stuff about, brown adipose tissue, and it's just burning fat off your body like crazy. And I'm like, wow, that would be cool. So I wanted to do a photo at one point, like eating a donut, like hanging out in the cold water thing with a bunch of ice cubes and stuff. But unfortunately, when you look at the research, there's some very cool things that happen on the physiology side, and there's some really cool stuff that happen on the psychology side. Unfortunately, I would say most of the stuff we've been told about the physiology is probably not true. Like, do you acutely use more fat hanging out in cold water if you're not shivering? Yes. Does that really add up to almost anything that's worthwhile? Unfortunately, no. Like, my little back of the envelope calculation was that I could only really find one study that kind of even tried to quantify it. And it was being in, I think it was a 51-degree room in shorts, t-shirt, shivering for, I think it was almost 2 hours to see like a significant amount of calories that were burned. All right. So, and when you're shivering, you have more muscle action. So you are burning a lot more calories. You're actually burning more carbohydrates too.
Wouldn't it be more comfortable to just jump rope for an hour?
Exactly. Yeah. The amount to have it be significant to approach exercise is just silly. It's so, if anyone's ever even tried doing that for like 10 minutes, it's horrible. It sucks so bad. And so I was like, oh crap, that didn't really work out so well. I'm like, well, what about recovery? Pretty mixed, right? There's actually some data showing that if your goal is ultimate hypertrophy, where you're trying to add as much muscle as humanly possible, getting in cold water immediately after training, probably not a good idea. Again, immediately after training, at least 50 degrees, probably 10 to 15 minutes. There is some cool effects, though, on glucose disposal, on metabolic health. So I did a thing where I measured my glucose just getting into cold water immersion. So around low 40 degrees for about 4 minutes. I measured it as soon as I got out, and it went from about mid 80s to like 57. I was able to repeat that a few times.
Which is statistically significant.
Yeah, pretty huge drop. So I think metabolic health is interesting. Last part too, which is super fascinating, is there's something called cross adaptation effects that haven't really been studied that much. So normally we think SAID principle, right? We think, you're going to have exposure to cold, you're going to get better adapted at the cold. That's 100%
here, real
true.
Quick, just for some of our users, SAID principle, specific adaptation to impose demands.
Yes,
right?
Correct. Yeah. So what?
Okay, so sorry.
That's all right. Thank you. If I'm training cold, I get better at exposure to cold. If I train my deadlift, I expect my deadlift, if I'm doing it in an intelligent manner, to get better. I train battling ropes, I'm probably gonna get better at battling ropes. However, there may be a transfer effect of some of those things too. I did battling ropes. Oh, cool. I got better at this other thing over here that doesn't look like battling ropes, but yet I got better at it from it. And there appears to be transfer effects also with these. So one of the cross adaptation and transfer effects was I took a group of people. One group had cold water immersion exposure for just one session. The other group did not. And then they put them in a hypoxic environment, right? So a low level of oxygen, and they measured their response to it. The group that had the cold water immersion actually did better in the hypoxic environment, so low levels of oxygen. So even though they're playing with temperature, they weren't playing with concentrations of oxygen, they seem to be more tolerant from it even after the cold water as a stimulus was removed. So
That's
there's some
awesome.
fascinating things on the physiology side I don't think we've figured out yet. But I think what's more useful on the psychology side is, as people will argue that, well, I just did a 20-second cold shower. Like physiologically, that's really not doing much for me. Like, probably not a lot. However, you still had to actively make the decision to do something that it sucks. It's not really a lot of fun, but you actively made that decision. And I think that skill set of being able to pick something that's a little bit hard, that you can do in a safe manner, but it's not going to be a lot of fun, to use that newer thinky professor prefrontal cortex part of your brain to kind of temporarily override your, lizard kind of primitive part of your brain.
Yeah.
I think that's a skill set that's going to be even more useful in the next, 1 to couple decades, because everything is going to be customized to your limbic brain, right? I mean, I can hit a button on my phone and like food shows up at my door, right? I mean, the amount of effort we have to put forth to get basic survival stuff, it's just going to be almost no effort.
Yeah.
Right. So I think you're going to have to train yourself to do some harder things. Maybe go for a walk, go outside, go exercise, get exposure to cold, maybe things change in pH, breathing, exercise. Those things initially, if you haven't done them yet and you're not in that habit, those initially start out as being hard. But training yourself to do those things, I think, is the way out of that whole loop then.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and so I find it really interesting just observing myself. I look forward to some of the hard things in my life,
Yes.
like exercise. I look forward to that. Crucial conversations or difficult conversations, I look forward to that. Like confrontation, I look forward to that. Those things don't bug me at all. But I'll tell you, I've done Wim Hof, his 10-week course. I've done like all sorts of different kinds of cold immersion, the polar plunge up here in Idaho, and then I've done cold showers for a really long time. And it is never, to me, it is never easy. Like it's always a struggle to turn that dial to cold or to create the cold, plunge, or whether it's a bathtub or a feeding trough or, water, whatever, large animal watering trough or something, fill it with ice. And I'm just the whole time I'm like, this is going to suck, butterflies, and having to like calm myself down and breathe and stay present, all of these things. It's interesting. Like I would think that I would have gotten better at that. And I think, I've gotten better at just making it happen, but it's still hard and it still sucks every single time. But after it's done, I feel better every time as well. But it's so funny how it's really difficult for me to imagine how good I'm going to feel when I'm turning that dial or prepping that, tub or whatever. It's just the whole time. It's like all I can do to stay present, breathe, and be like, it's going to be okay. You got this, whatever. Okay. And it's cold that does that, right? It's not, anything else. So
yeah, there's something very weird about that, because I have a 15.6 cubic freezer I've sealed and filled full of water. And right now I keep it at like 37, 38 degrees. So I can just sit in there up to my neck, and it makes it easy to do it. It's not too expensive once you have the freezer. But even after a year and a half of doing it, most days when I'm home, especially being home a lot more this past year, it still sucks. Like even today, like I didn't do much of it last week because I was like super tired. And today I found myself going, okay, I'm going to do it today for sure. Did my cardio, did my rowing. And then after I get done, it's so funny to like watch yourself go, okay, I got the lid open. The water's a little low. I should put a little more water in. So I'm putting more water in. And then I'm realizing, I'm like, hey, dumbass, you're just stalling because you don't want to get in there, and eventually you do, and it sucks and you live through it and you're fine. Yeah. But there's something about it that I would have predicted. And I did predict like a year and a half ago that, okay, doing this most days for a year and a half, it'll probably be relatively easy to get over that inertia to do it. And not really.
No, why is the cold water that's
it's weird.
That's the one. Man, and I don't know, maybe it's like that limbic, right? That lizard brain is just like
so hardwired.
You are stupid. Like this is the dumbest that you're doing the exact opposite of what we need to survive. Like what are you doing right now?
Yeah. And there's
very interesting.
there's an interesting statistic with that too. And I was looking at the research that I think it's like 10 to 20% of people die if they get exposed to very cold water, like a plane crash, or they're in a boat, or, something happens, that they actually drown within the first couple minutes. And at first I was like, wait a minute, hypothermia. And I'm like, no, wait a minute. Like, you could be buck naked in 34-degree water and you won't have hypothermia within 2 minutes. You're going to be cold. You're going to hate life, but you're not going to have frank hypothermia within a couple minutes.
Yeah.
And then I realized what happens is the water, especially when it would hit their face, would cause them to a gasp reflex. So they, like if you've ever been in super cold water and you inhale real fast, but they would be so nervous and freaked out that their head would be in the water and they would have a gas reflex and would fill their lungs full of water. And a certain percentage of people would actually drown. I was like, oh crap. So you could argue, even from a safety standpoint, just being able to control that response, and obviously a safe environment, might be useful too.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully nobody's getting put in those, those situations, but the thing is, I mean, we don't rise to the level of, our expectations. We fall to the level of our training. Yeah. Right. That's Epictetus or I don't know, one of those super warrior poet people back in the day said that. But yeah, so you mentioned tired. So you were tired, so you didn't do it. And I'm guessing that there's probably some physiological reason behind that, right? Like, you're already experiencing stress, so there's no need to stress yourself more. But maybe this is a perfect opportunity to then talk a little bit about sleep, because I know you're very aware of sleep hygiene. Your wife wrote a book that we get to read for kids, which we totally forgot to get her signature, but we'll do this. But yeah, so with Mr. Mold, talking about basically it's really helping parents with sleep hygiene, and obviously also helping kids too, but a lot of times the parents need it far more than the kids. So what do you in order of priority, where does sleep reside in terms of improving performance and strength or endurance or whatever the case might be? But then also maybe juxtapose that with people's ability to do the sleep thing, which is crucial, right? And I think you talk about this in your course as well, but I would love to chat about that specifically. Yeah.
So one of the things when I did the Flex Diet Cert was, I'm like, okay, like you said, how can I make this correct and as actionable as possible? Because I wanted people to spend 2 to 3 hours and have something to do with a client who walks in the door on Monday and feel pretty confident they could at least start with them, right? They could start the process with them. And, my brain goes, this is easy. I'll just rate everything based on physiologic response, right? Because some things are big rocks, some are smaller rocks. If they don't eat enough protein, worrying about adding creatine, probably not a big deal. But then I realized I had flashbacks to when I first started working with clients and about how much of a freaking disaster it was, because I had no notion of psychology. Like, idiot me 15 years ago, 20 years ago went, well, I know stuff about physiology. They must not. So they're coming to me. So I tell them the physiology stuff, and then they go do it and they lose weight. And everyone's like laughing now, like, haha, that's a pretty funny story. What I found real fast was that, oh shit, I should have been a psychologist, not a physiologist. I went back and took some neurobiology classes to try to remedy that a little bit. So I did rank them on physiologic intervention from 1 to 10. And things like sleep come up really high, right? Maybe a 9, maybe even a 10. You look at the research on the effects of sleep for performance enhancement, memory, skill acquisition, recovery, muscle repair. Like, you go down the list, it literally helps like everything. And then I have the flash forward conversations to clients about sleep habits. And I would much rather take 2 aspirin and try to pound my head through a wall than talk to a client about sleep, because almost all the discussions end up at the same point, right? They agree, they know that it's important, right? No one disputes that ever. But then you start walking them through your day. Okay, what time do you get up? Okay, go to work, or I'm on Zoom now and I've got the kids at home. And what you end up left with is, you get to the end of the day, it's 8 p.m. The kids finally went to bed. They're done training, whatever. And they have 2 hours to relax with their spouse before bed. And then they get up at 4 a.m. the next day. And so they're like, okay, trainer. So you're telling me that those 2 hours I spend with my spouse chilling out watching Netflix from 8 to 10, I shouldn't do that and I should just go to bed. You're kind of like, well, kind of, yeah. So you're literally having a value discussion with them about big things in their life that they may consider changing, right? Which is not a short-term process.
Yeah.
So when I came with the cert, I said, okay, I have something called coaching leverage, which is a physiologic impact times the client's psychologically ability to change. So sleep, let's say a 10. Client's ability to change, it's like a 1, right? It's usually abysmal. So in the ranking scale, sleep is actually the last intervention, not because of physiologic reasons, but mostly because it's very hard. It's a much more of a long-term process to get people to realize the value of it and get them to kind of slowly chip away at those changes. But the good part is if you know that going in, like you can have a better conversation about it, right? And you don't feel like I felt completely defeated in the past. Every time I talk to the client about sleep, I'm like, why can't I just get through to this person? Why do they not understand? And then
I've shown them
I'm being an unreasonable idiot.
If I just show them one more study.
See one more study. I'll throw Matthew Walker's book at him again and again. And, you know, that didn't help.
And I'll tell you though, I mean, me, and probably because I'm an analytical nerd and I overthink everything, that has helped me, like really understanding like how crucially important it is from a physiological standpoint. And so what I do is I do both ends. So like some mornings I get up at 4:30 so I can get certain things done or whatever. But then as I start to accrue sleep debt, then by, a third morning, I'll let myself sleep in as much as myself needs to sleep in. And then unfortunately, because I have kids, sometimes that gets interrupted and doesn't work out the way. And then I have to try it again another night. But usually by 1 or 2 nights, then I'm caught up on my sleep debt and then I can kind of redo it. And that's my way of sort of like doing what is, physiologically important, but then also, I still value that psychological piece. And like you said, like being able to hang out with my wife at night is really important. And so that just may mean that some mornings I don't get up at 4:30 to get the certain things done that I would normally get done, from 4:30 to 6:30 before the beasts wake up, the kids get up and do kid stuff. So I think that's so crucial. You've done such a great job of quantifying both the psychological and the physiological, because if everybody did the physiologically perfect, then they would just be seeing incredible results. But the problem is life happens, right? Or habits are already there, or prioritization or certain values are just always there. So, giving them the tools to go, okay, this is going to be really important and impactful for you. But I also understand if you've got all these other things going, then maybe we'll set this aside and do this other thing, or just do what we can here with what we have, and then move into, maybe something else that's going to be more effective, even if it's on the physiological side, not ranked as high, but your ability to do it is so through the roof that now you've just put numbers to it, which is awesome. My brain loves that. But then even clients, right? I could imagine you're not even saying that you have to rank it or whatever, but you're able to now navigate that psychology that is there, that every trainer, if you've even trained one client one time, you understand that is a real thing. And that can be a very difficult obstacle to overcome when you're trying to get them to their goals.
Yeah. And even then, once they get to the sleep module, which is 8 out of 8, one of the action items that I recommend is you get sunlight exposure earlier in the morning. Right. So you would think that the number one action then would be just berate them till they go to bed early. It's like, well, that's not going to work so well. You may get there, but it's probably just going to get pissed off at you. So I'm like, okay, so how can I kind of maybe quote unquote trick them to go to bed a little bit earlier? Oh, most people have a dysregulated circadian rhythm. So the fastest way to re-regulate it is to see sunlight in the morning without behind any windows or glasses or anything like that. And when you do that, especially after a couple of weeks, even just 10, 15, 20 minutes a day, go up, do your walk, take the dog out, whatever, park far away at work. you'll be more awake during the day. So hopefully you'll get, more things done. And then you'll actually get really tired at night. And I found that was like the key to getting people to go to bed earlier, because most people will like power through the little drop in the afternoon, drink some more coffee, and then they're literally not as tired as they should be at the time they need to go to bed. So it gets easier to stay up. So if you can do something earlier in the day to kind of reset that whole cycle, then it's easier for them and it's not as difficult.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously some people don't like working out in the morning, but if people can change that, it's like, that's it's like, hey, if you can work out, and then if you can work out outside, like earlier you do that, then the better, right? It goes. So do you recommend then like a blue blocker or something to that effect to keep that, that endocrine system from cranking out like what they think is daylight when they're on their phones or chilling in Netflix and whatever else, right?
Yeah, I think it's useful overall. One thing I noticed that was interesting was that when we go on trips, we would go to Costa Rica or we would be down other places in Baja, Mexico or South Padre. The more outside I was, like I could forget my blue blockers and be in like blinding daylight at night. And I was just so tired I would go to bed. And at first I thought, it's just because I'm getting more activity during the day. And we had a couple of times I was down there kiteboarding and there was no wind, but I was still outside in the morning, did some meditation, did some runs, did that kind of stuff. And I realized that, and there's some research now to show this, that if you have enough light coming into the eyes, that's probably a really big anchor. And if that is big enough, you can probably buffer some brighter lights in the evening. Having said that, I think doing both is probably better. All right, so a couple of things you can do in the evening: make your lights lower. If you can use more of an amber or red type lens, that might be better. Again, it's not just only the blue light, but it's also the angle of the lights. If you think about being outside in sunlight, we have these little receptors that are primarily on the bottom part of the eyeball. So when the sun is overhead, we're still able to get those photons into the eye and register that light. So do the opposite in the evening. If you've got lights overhead, so we have two different sets of lights in almost all of our house. We have like the big bright lights that hang overhead. And then we've got smaller like 40-watt bulbs and lamps along the side and like a red light. So in the evening, we'll turn the overhead lights off, pull all the shades to not mimic the sun. And then if we have light on, it'll be from these lower sources that's not as bright, because the angle also matters too.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So chickens are far more lizard brain.
Yes.
maybe some mammalian in there, zero like upper cognitive, right? Or at least as I can see, it's zero upper cognitive. And we, so to keep them producing eggs in the winter, all we do is we just have a light, and it's just a regular light. It's not like some fancy full spectrum light or something like that, but just a regular, 60-watt light or whatever. And we put it up in the top in their coop, and we turn it on at like 3 a.m, and it runs until sunrise, which is in the deepest part of winter. The sun doesn't rise until like 7:30. Yeah. Right. Because we're in that upper north country like you are.
Yes, definitely.
Right. But by doing that, they produce it's super cold. So you would think that the cold would have something to do with it. They can't move around as much because the snow, right? A lot of times, and they don't like getting into deep snow, which makes sense because right.
Sure, chicken legs.
Exactly. It's so funny to see if they like fly into the snow and then they have to like flap to get out. They are dumb animals for sure. But so you would think, pecking and scratching and moving around might help them produce more. No, it's just the light. Just the light, and everything changes. Like everything changes, and they just produce eggs at the same rate. And maybe that's playing God and messing. But this is like, normal. Like if you have a farm and you need to eat, and you're feeding your chickens, you don't want your feed to go to waste. You want your feed to go into the thing also that you're eating. And so just adding that light literally changes everything. And it's just a light. It's not a heat lamp. It's still super cold out there for them, but it's pretty interesting. So I would believe that obviously we're much further from that, right? Upper cognitive, more mammalian brain and all of that stuff. But I think that those things still anchor and hold true. Like we were saying with the cold water, right? It's like that
Yeah.
limbic brain is really just like, no way, dude, don't do this. You're dumb. So I could imagine that just the light would make a huge difference. And that, I mean, I've already been doing that, and I've seen a huge difference. Like during, when I was a kid living up here in North Idaho, we didn't do any of that stuff,
Yeah.
but I probably slept way more. I don't sleep as much now. And so to prevent SAD for our entire family, seasonal affective disorder or whatever, and also to just try to make sure I'm going to bed at the right time and not staying up, too late or whatever, is I turn that full spectrum light on in the morning, right? And bathe in it for 15 minutes before the sun gets up, when I get up at 4:30 or 5:30 or whatever. And that makes a big difference for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Especially if you're in areas where you start your day earlier than when the sun comes up, right? That makes complete sense, So yeah, cool.
Yeah. Well, so with every single one of our guests, we ask this question, and it's basically what's living fit to you, and obviously not living.fit the brand or whatever, but what is living fit? And I would love to hear, all of your school, all of your education, all of your math, all of your understanding. I would love to hear your perspective on what living fit is.
To me, I think at its simplest level, it's just, do you have the capacity to do what you love doing? Because if everyone who knows, who has had, portions of their life where they were not as fit, everything's just harder. Like from just strength to cardiovascular to your energy to, everything else, right? So I think of just even nutrition and training, that those are things that take time, but they're also an investment, right? And even, like the lockdown stuff started in March. I'm like, hey, this is a good time to do a lot more aerobic fitness again, because I had kind of slacked off on that a little bit. And after 6 weeks of doing that, I was like, oh yeah, I do feel a lot better. Oh, because it's, even if you're losing just a tiny bit each day, you don't really notice it, right? It's like sitting in a warehouse that has like 100 light bulbs and like one goes out every day. It's like, you could be sitting in the dark 100 days later and you're like, what happened?
Yeah.
But it's a very gradual thing if you're going down that you may not realize.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's definitely a good investment, and then just allows people to do what they love doing and help more other people, and everything gets better.
I love it. Well, do some shameless plugs. So where could people find your certifications right now? How can they figure out more about Dr. Mike T. Nelson? Let's let everybody know, because man, the coursework is invaluable, just selfishly for me, let alone the applicability, being able to apply it for all of the clients and all of the people that, follow us and want to learn more. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the best place is just go to flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET. There'll be a way there to get on the wait list, and that'll put them on the semi-daily newsletter. And so they'll get information then about when the Flex Diet opens, when the Physiologic Flexibility Cert opens. And I usually send content out most days, probably 5-6 days a week. And they'll have all the content there. Some stuff on social media, but right now, most of probably 90% of the stuff I do is through the newsletter. So Flex Diet, FLEXDIET.com is the place. And when you're on there, just, hit reply. Tell me you listened into this podcast, and we'll send you a cool gift for free.
Yeah. Love it.
Yeah.
So which one should I do first, right? If I'm getting on there, should I do the Flex Diet course first or the physiologic flexibility? Which one? Yeah.
So
they're proper order?
I designed them to be a little bit independent. So I would say if people really want to get good at nutrition and recovery, if they think that's kind of their limiting factor, or their clients, that's their limiting factor, I would say, do that one first. If you've got clients where you're like, the nutrition's pretty good, their training's, pretty on par, their sleep's, pretty good, and they're always kind of sending you crazy ass biohacker questions and are always kind of looking for like, what's the next thing to do, then I would say the physiologic flexibility cert would be a little bit better, because we go through everything from, light exposure, heat, cold, pH changes, high intensity exercise, low intensity exercise, blood glucose, oxygen, CO2, breathing techniques, all that kind of stuff.
And it's there's a lot of prac app in there too,
yeah, it's the same format. So
yeah.
It's so funny how they get blinding flashes of the obvious. I was doing the physiologic flexibility cert. I'm like, oh man, I just don't know how I'm going to organize all this material. And then one day I'm like literally on a walk and I'm like, hey, dumbass, why don't you do like the same format you did before? Because that seemed to work pretty good. I'm like, oh yeah.
I love it. I love it. Well, Dr. Mike T. Nelson, we could nerd out all day long, and I'm sure I will get to see you soon, and definitely talk to you even sooner. I thank you so much for all of the effort and the work that you've put into everything that you've done in school and now out of school, so that we can get better one little action at a time, as we choose our own little life adventures here, specifically and especially with understanding that you've presented to us. So I really appreciate your time. And this is Living That Fit. Go check Dr. Mike T. Nelson out today.